The DNA report just landed. My genetic code matches a 1924 murder victim. I'm holding the flash drive labeled The Vessel Project. But my sister's standing in the doorway, eyes locked on me like I'm prey. The security contractor's bootsteps pound closer. I have seconds before he kicks in the door. My own mother's outside, smiling like she just set the trap. And I've got nowhere to run. The trophy in my hand is my only weapon. One swing could buy me time, but Rebecca's already moving, silent, deliberate. The keys to the Virginia estate dig into my palm. If I don't make it out, I'll never know why my DNA belongs to a dead man, or why my family's hunting me. Blue light from the laptop screen seared Ethan's retinas, casting long, jagged shadows across the peeling wallpaper of his apartment. The whistleblower's PDF flickered. On the left, a grainy forensic scan of a skull found in a 1924 cold case file. On the right, Ethan's own sequenced genome, uploaded 3 weeks ago under a pseudonym. The sequences aligned. Every marker, every twisted rung of the double helix, snapped into place with mathematical cruelty. He wasn't a descendant, he was a carbon copy. The air in the room tasted of ozone and stale coffee, thick enough to choke on. Ethan's breath hitched, a ragged sound in the hollow silence of his room. He stared at the screen until the letters began to swim like insects. The whistleblower, a man named David Vance, who had vanished from the grid 2 days prior, hadn't just sent a report. He had sent a death sentence. The data was undeniable. The 1924 murder victim, a man whose body had been pulled from the Chicago River a century ago, shared a genetic signature that was identical to Ethan's, down to the rarest mutations. It was a biological impossibility. Nature didn't repeat itself with such precision. He leaned back, his spine refusing to touch the chair. 1, 2, 3. He counted the heartbeats thudding against his ribs. He felt like a ghost inhabiting a stolen frame. If he was a clone, then his entire life, the birthdays, the childhood scars, the memories of his mother's cold touch, was a fabrication, a scripted play performed in a body that didn't belong to him. He was a vessel, a biological container for a legacy he didn't understand. The realization sat in his gut like lead. He needed proof, not digital files or encrypted whispers, but the physical artifacts of his existence. He needed to see the ink on his own birth certificate, to touch the paper and smell the dust of the lies his father had curated. He closed the laptop with a sharp click, the sound echoing like a gunshot in the cramped apartment. 24 hours later, he stood inside his father's Chicago study. The scent of old leather and expensive bourbon clung to the heavy oak panels. The house was silent, a tomb of Victorian opulence and modern surveillance. Ethan slid a letter opener into the locked drawer of the mahogany desk. Metal scraped against metal, a high-pitched screech that set his teeth on edge. The wood groaned, then yielded with a sharp crack that sounded like a breaking bone. He shuffled through yellowed birth certificates and brittle hospital records, his pulse drumming against his eardrums. Rain lashed the window pane, blurring the city lights into smears of neon orange. He was looking for the inconsistencies, the gaps in the timeline where a laboratory might have replaced a womb. His fingers felt numb as he brushed past deeds to properties in Virginia and medical ledgers filled with names he didn't recognize. Looking for something, Ethan? He froze. The letter opener slipped from his hand, clattering onto the desk. Rebecca leaned against the doorframe, her silhouette cutting through the dim hallway light. She toyed with a silver necklace, the metal clicking against her fingernails with a rhythmic, predatory cadence. Her hair was shorn close to her scalp, making her eyes appear unnaturally large and unblinking. "Dad keeps the real files in the floorboard," she said, her voice dropping to a sandpaper whisper that scraped against the silence. She stepped into the room, the floorboard silent beneath her weight, moving with a feline grace that made Ethan's skin prickle. "But you won't like what the ink says. Some truths are better left buried in the marrow, don't you think?" Ethan gripped the edge of the desk, his knuckles white. "What am I, Rebecca? Tell me the truth." She didn't answer. She only watched him with a terrifying stillness, her reflection in the dark window appearing to hover over his shoulder. This house, his sister, his very bones, everything belonged to a man who died a century ago. He could feel the weight of the lineage pressing down on him, a suffocating pressure that made the air feel thin. The silence was shattered by the heavy tread of boots in the hallway. Ethan didn't wait for an explanation. He knew the sound of his father's security staff. A man in a dark tactical suit burst through the patio doors, the glass shattering in a diamond spray that caught the orange streetlights. The intruder didn't speak. He moved with the clinical efficiency of a butcher. Ethan lunged. He didn't have a weapon, but he had the desperation of a man who had already lost his soul. He grabbed a heavy architectural trophy from the desk, a jagged spire of bronze, and swung it with every ounce of terror in his frame. The metal connected with the man's temple with a sickening thud. The guard crumpled, his breath escaping in a wet wheeze. Adrenaline surged through Ethan, a hot, metallic tide. He reached into the guard's tactical vest, his fingers slick with sweat. He found a heavy set of keys labeled Virginia Estate and a silver flash drive embossed with a symbol he recognized from the whistleblower's files. A stylized vessel. The Vessel Project. He didn't look at Rebecca as he bolted for the door. He didn't look at the man bleeding on the Persian rug. He ran for the garage, his boots pounding against the marble floors. 12, 13, 14. He counted the steps, the numbers of frantic prayer against the abyss opening beneath him. He threw himself into his car, the engine roaring to life with a guttural snarl. As he peeled out of the driveway, the tires screaming against the asphalt, he glanced back at the house. His mother, Martha, stood on the porch. The smell of antiseptic seemed to reach him even through the glass. She wasn't screaming. She wasn't calling the police. She simply stood there, her hands folded neatly in front of her, wearing a chilling, detached smile. She looked like a scientist, watching a tagged animal flee into the woods, knowing exactly where the traps were set. By the time he reached the outskirts of Chicago, the rain had turned into a steady, oppressive drizzle. Ethan's hands shook on the steering wheel. He needed to disappear, but the keys in his pocket felt like they were burning a hole through his jeans. Virginia. That was where the answers were. That was where the project had its heart. He pulled into a remote gas station 3 hours later, the neon sign flickering with a dying hum. The air smelled of gasoline and damp pine. He needed cash, a way to move without leaving a digital trail. He stepped up to the rusted ATM and slid his card in. Transaction denied. Contact your institution. He tried again. The same cold, mechanical rejection. They had cut him off. He was a biological asset, and the owners had flipped the switch. A hollow pit formed in his stomach. He walked back to the car, his movements stiff. He needed to check the vehicle. If they could freeze his money, they could find his location. He knelt in the oily puddles beneath the rear bumper, his fingers searching the cold metal of the chassis. His heart skipped a beat when his hand brushed against something that didn't belong. A small black plastic box, held in place by a powerful magnet. A GPS tracker. The red light on its side blinked with a rhythmic, mocking pulse. Blink, blink, blink. They weren't just following him. They were hurting him. He ripped the tracker off and hurled it into the dark woods bordering the station. But the damage was done. He was a marked man in a stolen body, and the world was closing in. He drove through the night, the mountain roads of West Virginia winding like a snake through the fog. The silence of the cabin was broken by his phone. It wasn't a call. It was a file, pushed to his device by an untraceable source. He hit play, expecting a threat. Instead, a voice filled the car. It was high-pitched, a child's voice, but the cadence was unmistakable. It was him. "The marrow is the ink," the child Ethan whispered on the recording. "The bone is the pen. I am the vessel for the one who comes again." Ethan's skin crawled. He had no memory of saying those words. He had no memory of the ritualistic chanting that followed, a low, dissonant hum that sounded like a funeral dirge. The recording was old, the hiss of the tape underlying the words. But the message was clear. His childhood hadn't been a series of scraped knees and school plays. It had been a long, slow conditioning. He was a crop being raised for harvest. The headlights of a vehicle appeared in his rearview mirror, twin needles of white light cutting through the mist. It was a black SUV, massive and predatory. It didn't signal. It didn't try to pass. It simply accelerated, the roar of its engine echoing off the granite cliffs. Ethan gripped the wheel, his knuckles aching. The SUV slammed into his rear bumper, the impact jarring his teeth. The mountain road was slick, the drop-off to the right, a sheer plunge into blackness. They weren't trying to stop him. They were trying to run him off the road. He shifted gears, the transmission whining in protest. He knew these roads from the maps he'd memorized in his father's study. There was a hairpin turn 2 miles ahead, a sharp cut back toward the valley. He waited until the SUV lunged again, its tires screaming as it tried to pit maneuver him. At the last possible second, Ethan slammed on the brakes and yanked the wheel. His car fish-tailed, the scent of burning rubber filling the cabin. The SUV, carrying too much momentum, couldn't compensate. It sailed past him, its brakes locking up in a futile shriek of metal on asphalt. He watched in the mirror as the heavy vehicle smashed through the flimsy guardrail. For a second, it seemed to hang in the air, a dark shadow against the gray fog, before it vanished into the abyss. A dull, distant thud echoed up the cliffside, followed by silence. Ethan didn't stop to look for survivors. He couldn't afford the luxury of a conscience. He drove until the sun began to bleed over the horizon, a bruised purple light that revealed the iron gates of the Virginia estate. The house was a monstrosity of gray stone and ivy, perched on a hill like a vulture. He used the stolen keys to bypass the perimeter gate, the heavy iron bars groaning as they swung open. He parked the car in a thicket of overgrown oaks and approached the house on foot. The air here smelled of damp earth and something sweet, rotting lilies. He entered through a servant's entrance. The interior of the house, a labyrinth of velvet curtains and silent clocks. He made his way toward the library, his boots muffled by the thick Persian rugs. He found the trigger behind a bust of a man who shared his jawline. A section of the bookshelf slid back with a hiss of hydraulics, revealing a narrow, concrete stairwell. Ethan counted as he descended. 1, 2, 3. The basement office was a stark contrast to the opulence above. It was a bunker of glass and steel, filled with the low hum of server racks and the sterile scent of bleach. Files were stacked on a central desk, and a single monitor glowed in the corner. He moved toward the desk, his heart hammering. But he wasn't alone. I knew you'd find the way, Ethan. He spun around. Chloe sat in a leather chair in the corner, her face partially obscured by the shadows. She looked exactly as she had when he'd left her 3 days ago, the girl next door with the wide, trusting eyes and the soft voice. Chloe? What are you doing here? We have to go. I found it. I found what they're doing. He stopped. His eyes fell on a leather-bound ledger open on the desk. It wasn't a medical file. It was a financial record. Payee, Chloe Davis. Service, biological and psychological monitoring of subject E-04. The dates went back 5 years. Every month, a deposit of $10,000. Every week, a detailed report on his sleep patterns, his diet, his emotional triggers. Even their first date, the accidental meeting at the coffee shop, was logged as initial contact, successful. The betrayal hit him harder than the SUV. He felt the air leave his lungs. 5 years, he whispered. Every I love you, every plan we made, it was just a job. Chloe stood up, her expression shifting from the warmth he knew to a cold, professional detachment. It was an assignment, Ethan. You were a high-value asset. You needed a handler who could keep you stable until the transition. You have to understand, you're not a person in the way they are. You're a vessel. You're a masterpiece of engineering. I'm a human being. Ethan snarled, his voice breaking. Are you? Chloe stepped closer, her voice dropping to that familiar, soothing tone that now made him want to scream. You're a biological duplicate of Silas Miller. Your memories are placeholders. Your personality is a temporary construct. You were built to house something greater. Don't you feel it? The humming in your ears? The way your blood feels too heavy for your veins? That's him, Ethan. That's Silas. He's waking up. Ethan backed away, his hand hitting a shortwave radio on the console. He saw the frequency dial, the local sheriff's department. If he could just get a signal out, if he could bring the law into this nightmare. He lunged for the radio, his fingers fumbling with the dials. Mayday, Mayday. This is Ethan Miller at the Blackwood Estate. I'm being held against my... The door to the office slammed open. Thomas Miller stepped into the room, his massive frame filling the doorway. He didn't look like a man in his 50s. He looked like a statue carved from granite. He walked across the room with a terrifying, measured pace and picked up a heavy brass paperweight from the desk. With a single, casual motion, he brought the brass down onto the radio. The plastic shattered, and the vacuum tubes inside imploded with a sharp, dying pop. The signal went dead. The time for talking to the help is over, Ethan, Thomas said, his voice a deep, resonant boom. Ethan tried to push past him, but Thomas caught him by the throat. The strength was impossible. It wasn't the strength of a man. It was the grip of a hydraulic press. Thomas lifted him off the floor, pinning him against the heavy bookshelves. Ethan kicked, his fingers clawing at his father's hand, but it was like trying to move a mountain. Look at you, Thomas mused, staring into Ethan's eyes with a clinical curiosity. So much wasted effort. You think this Ethan character is real? It's just a glitch, son. A bit of static in the hardware. We're going to clear that away tonight. We're going to give this body back to the man who earned it. Ethan's vision began to blur, the edges of the room turning gray. Kill me, he wheezed. Kill you? Thomas laughed, a sound like grinding stones. We're not going to kill you. We're going to overwrite you. You'll still be there, tucked away in a corner of your own mind, watching through the windows while Silas takes the wheel. You'll be a passenger in your own skin, forever. Thomas dropped him. Ethan Ethan collapsed to the floor, gasping for air, his throat feeling like it had been crushed. He scrambled toward the door, his mind screaming for an exit. He burst out of the office and into the main hall, the grand staircase looming above him like the ribs of a giant beast. He saw the flashing blue and red lights through the frosted glass of the front doors. A surge of hope, sharp and desperate, rose in his chest. The sheriff, Robert Taylor. Ethan had seen him in town, a weather-beaten man who looked like he believed in the badge. Ethan threw the doors open, stumbling out onto the gravel driveway. "Sheriff, help me. My father, they're trying to—" Sheriff Taylor stood by his patrol car, his hand resting on his heavy brass belt buckle. He didn't draw his weapon. He didn't move to protect Ethan. As Thomas Miller stepped out onto the porch, the sheriff did something that made Ethan's world tilt on its axis. The lawman took off his hat, bowed his head, and sank to one knee on the wet gravel. "The vessel is ready, my lord," the sheriff whispered, his voice trembling with a terrifying, cultish devotion. Ethan froze. The entire town, the law, the woman he loved, they weren't his world. They were the walls of his cage. "He's being difficult, Robert," Thomas said, stepping down the stairs. "Subdue him." Ethan turned to run, but the sheriff was faster than he looked. He pulled a heavy black taser from his belt. The trigger clicked. Ethan felt the twin barbs bite into his back, followed by a localized explosion of white-hot agony. 50,000 volts surged through his nervous system, turning his muscles into rigid cables of pain. He couldn't scream. His lungs were locked in a permanent inhale. He hit the ground hard, the gravel tearing at his cheek, but he couldn't even feel the scrape. His body was no longer his own. It was a malfunctioning machine, twitching in the dirt. "Careful with the skin." Martha's voice drifted down from the porch. She had appeared like a ghost, her white dress luminous in the moonlight. "We don't want any scarring for the ascension." Ethan felt hands grabbing his arms and legs. He was dragged, his toes scraping against the stone, down a secondary set of stairs he hadn't seen. The air grew colder, smelling of ancient copper and ozone. They brought him into the surgical theater. It was a nightmare of contradictions. Stainless steel robotic arms and high-resolution monitors surrounding a central altar of black stone, carved with symbols that seemed to writhe in the flickering light. They strapped him down. Cold leather bit into his wrists and ankles. A heavy strap was tightened across his forehead, pinning his skull to the stone. He could only look up at the massive, multi-bulbed surgical light above him. It looked like a halo of burning eyes. "Midnight," Thomas whispered, checking a silver pocket watch. "The blood is at its peak." Ethan saw the cult members filing into the room, their faces hidden behind porcelain masks. They began to hum, the same dissonant dirge from the recording. The vibration traveled through the stone altar and into Ethan's bones, making his marrow ache. A tray was wheeled over. Ethan saw the glint of scalpels, the long needles of neuroinjectors, and a small glass vial labeled anaphylactic catalyst. His mind, sharpened by the proximity of death, processed the labels with a frantic, cold logic. He felt a sharp prick in his arm. "The first stage of the erasure," Martha said, standing over him with a syringe. "Sleep now, little bird. When you wake up, you'll be a king." The drug hit his system like a wave of cold lead. His vision began to tunnel. He could feel the Ethan part of him, his memories of the Chicago lakefront, the smell of his grandmother's kitchen, the feeling of the wind on the Oregon coast, beginning to fray at the edges, like a photograph left in the sun. But he wasn't gone yet. His hand was loose in the leather strap. During the struggle, He had managed to palm a small, discarded scalpel from the tray as they moved him. The metal bit into his palm, the pain a tiny, flickering candle in the darkness of the drug. He saw a small bowl on the side table, a snack left by a careless technician. It was filled with peanuts. Ethan knew his own medical history. He knew the one glitch in his biological design that the Millers had never been able to sequence out. A lethal, systemic allergy to nuts. He forced his fingers to move, a Herculean effort against the rising tide of the sedative. He reached out, his fingertips brushing the bowl. He grabbed a handful of the crushed nuts and shoved them into his mouth, swallowing them dry before anyone could notice. The reaction was almost instantaneous. His throat began to tighten. His heart rate skyrocketed, the monitor attached to his chest beginning to beep with a frantic, staccato rhythm. His skin erupted in hives, and his breath became a wet, whistling gasp. "What's happening?" Thomas shouted, lunging toward the table. "The vitals are crashing." "Anaphylaxis," Martha cried, her porcelain mask slipping. "He's closing up. If the heart stops before the transition, the soul won't take. Loosen the straps. He needs an airway." In the chaos, the cultists fumbled with the buckles. They needed the vessel alive, even if it was broken. As the strap across his chest was released, Ethan's hand, still clutching the scalpel, shot out. He didn't strike Thomas. He didn't have the strength. Instead, he plunged the blade into the thick rubber hose of the pressurized oxygen tank standing next to the altar. The hiss of escaping gas filled the room, a high-pitched scream. "No!" Thomas lunged for him, but Ethan had one last spark of defiance. He reached for the surgical laser on the swinging arm above him and triggered the calibration beam. The light hit the concentrated oxygen. The explosion wasn't a bang, it was a roar of white heat. The surgical theater turned into a furnace in a heartbeat. The force of the blast threw Ethan backward, the stone altar shielding him from the worst of the fire. He heard the screams of the cultists, the sound of glass shattering, and the groan of the ceiling as the ancient stone began to buckle. He didn't look back. He crawled through the smoke, his lungs screaming for air, guided only by the counting in his head. 1, 2, 3. He found a ventilation shaft, the metal hot against his skin. He dragged himself through the dark, cramped space until he felt the cold bite of the night air. He tumbled out onto the grass, the Virginia estate behind him, a pyre of orange flames. The house was dying. The legacy was burning. Weeks later, the sound of the Pacific Ocean was the only thing Ethan allowed himself to hear. He sat on the porch of a small, weather-beaten motel in Oregon, the salt spray crusting on his skin. He went by the name James Smith now. He worked as a night janitor, his life a series of gray hallways and silent rooms. He had his grocery list in his pocket, the one his grandmother had written. It was his anchor. He was free. The Millers were dead, the records destroyed, the vessel project a heap of ash in a Virginia valley. He stood up and walked into the small, cramped bathroom of the motel. He avoided mirrors usually, but tonight, he felt a strange, heavy pressure behind his eyes. He looked at his reflection. The face was the same, angular, tired, haunted. But then he saw it. On the left side of his neck, a small, dark mole that had been there since birth. It had moved. It was an inch higher than it had been yesterday. He leaned closer, his breath fogging the glass. As he watched, his jawline seemed to shift, the bone density changing with a slow, grinding ache he could feel in his teeth. His eyes, once a clear blue, were beginning to cloud with a dark, oily gray. He tried to speak, to say his name, James, but his throat wouldn't form the word. Instead, A low, dissonant hum vibrated in his chest. A funeral dirge. He realized then that the explosion hadn't been enough. You can't burn a legacy when it's written in the marrow. The DNA was a clock, and it was still ticking. Silas Miller wasn't coming from the outside. He was blooming from within. Ethan gripped the edges of the sink, his knuckles turning white as his fingers elongated, the skin stretching over the bone like wet parchment. He looked into the mirror one last time, and for a split second, he didn't see himself. He saw a man from 1924, smiling with a predatory stillness. The count stopped at 0. The end. Do not proceed past this point.